Hello, Patricia Berry.
Hello, Jessica Letaw.
Shall we be white women who talk about white women today?
That would be a tremendous thing. I would like that.
Very good. Uh,
I feel like this is a conversation in progress, which is one of the things I love about occasionally we do it live in front of maybe hundreds of people.
okay.
But the fact that you and I have these conversations on such a regular basis is one of the gifts of our friendship that I really appreciate.
It is, and I'm glad we're here. So, for folks who may not have joined us last time or didn't totally track what we were up to, we created some working agreements to help Patricia and I sort of keep fidelity to the goals of the project, which are to grow along with the book and also to continue to resist white culture and dominant culture characteristics as we go along. So, the last conversation, we set 4 working agreements with each other, and we're going to read them back and forth. I'm going to start and say that we've decided that we have no right to comfort. Over the series, we're going to continue to unpack a lot of the reasons behind this. Today, we're going to say that we don't have the right to comfort in this learning. This is not a safe space. The world we're trying to address and the problems we're trying to solve are not safe, so this is a brave space. So, between Patricia and I and the folks that are coming along with us in these conversations, I invite us and you into loving accountability. Patricia, you and I have known and loved each other for a really long time. So let us love each other enough to tell the truth and to hold up mirrors that need holding up. We have said before, and I really deeply believe that kindness and honesty are not mutually exclusive. So when it is time to put aside niceness in the service of honesty and truth and hard work, let's do that.
And as a second expectation, we've agreed to ask for the speed that we need. Um, Jess and I have invited each other to ask for the pace that we need to do this learning. Speaking for myself, when I'm doing deep learning, I often need to go a little slower to let me mull on new ideas. As much as I'm an external processor and kind of a extrovert in many situations, a lot of times, particularly when it's a subject like this that I hold very deep and entrenched cultural teachings that I'm trying to unlearn, sometimes I need to pause and mull on what I'm feeling, thinking, and how it's expressing itself. So allowing each other the time we need to think and speak. You'll see us do that as an example, pausing and having some silence to reflect. The other thing that we have agreed on together is to resist binary thinking. We have invited each other to resist black and white thinking, except where we're talking about race. There's no right or wrong. There's no either or. We want to resist those concepts. What we are is unpacking, discussing, learning, evolving.
And to that end, our final working agreement for each other is to welcome conflict. In dominant culture and in the Midwest, and as women and a Native Southerner, we are often rewarded for being nice instead of being real and for being conciliatory instead of leaning into disagreement. So I would like to invite us to allow a lot of emotional space to be in conflict with each other, with the ideas presented in the book and other places, and even with ourselves. All right. Do you feel agreed upon, Patricia?
I feel very centered in those agreements. And I love that you and I review them every time we do this
Mm-hmm.
in order to determine if they still feel right or
Mm-hmm.
if something's missing or if something needs to be added because, like most humans, we evolve.
Yes. yes. Good. All right. So I want to lead us into a couple of things. The first thing is um, for folks who are following along with us on LinkedIn and other places, we have invited in the past, we've invited questions and comments in the comments section. At the end of this conversation, we will leave some time for questions if we get any in and have a conversation with you all. Today, for folks that are watching either live or after the fact, I invite and challenge you to comment. There as we get into this chapter in particular, we are going to talk about how easy it is to invisibilize your learning, which is also a way of keeping yourself from progressing. So I want for us to kind of declare us to ourselves, to each other. Comment, find your community, find your people, talk to folks in the comment section, but just kind of let it be known that this is a project that you're working on, to the extent, of course, that it's safe for you to do so. But we have talked, and we're going to be talking about what it means to actively resist, really all the ways that whiteness shows up in our work, in our relationships, and one of those ways is silence. And so I would just like to encourage us to not be silent in this work. And again, we'll get to questions and comments if there's anything that you'd like for us to respond to at the end of our conversation. And now I would like to lead us into a new section as of today, which is the White Lady Check-In.
And we are two white ladies.
We are two white ladies, so let us check in. And what I kind of had in mind for this is, before we get into kind of the meat of the chapter, I'm curious for you and for myself, how has whiteness shown up for you this week in your work, in your relationships, in yourself, in your thinking? Like how is whiteness manifested?
Are you asking me first?
I am asking you first.
So the thing I'd like to say about that is going to also, at some point, we're going to lead into another conversation about this. But one of the things that we read about in the chapter was how body language informed how people were experiencing racism at the dinners, specifically how they were responding or not responding, or not even looking at Regina Jackson as she was conveying some hard commentary and insight into how the dinners were going. In the first chapter, the preface, which was really meaty. I highly encourage anybody read the preface, because
we could have done a week on the preface.
I think if I had realized how meaty the preface was, because the preface is where both of the authors kind of laid out what they were doing and how they did it, and why they brought a third person as the kind of moderator of the experience, that they then went and did the dinners. And even, conversations around payment and how racism showed up in their request for payment and all of that stuff. It's a very good chapter. And truthfully, a lot of my thoughts this week came around that. So this is a very sideways conversation to say. What I'm thinking a lot about is, at the end of our last conversation, Jess and I debriefed. And one of the things that we looked at was body language as we were on this space. And I really identified, and Jess also identified, how much I smile and joke and have body language that kind of makes this comfortable and accessible for other white women watching. And that's one of the ways that my whiteness shows up all the time, that my sense of humor, and a lot of times my body language and the way that I smile and when I use that, is about making difficult subject matter acceptable, and not, I don't want to offend anybody, so I'm going to make a joke. And even as I'm sitting here, I'm noticing I'm looking at my video, and of course, here I am smiling, right? I'm looking at the video, and it's not that I want to be like taciturn or anything, but I'm just recognizing that I am using joking and humor as a way to diffuse some of the tenseness that I personally am feeling in this conversation. And that's one of the ways that my whiteness is showing up for me this week, because I'm paying attention in a different way based on our feedback of ourselves.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I did really, let me pause and say, I really appreciate you offering that reflection, that to be able to look at yourself sort of in the moment or just after the moment and say, I didn't show up entirely the way that I wanted to, is a difficult thing and a powerful one. And so I appreciate you modeling that for me and for us. And I also really appreciated the exercise of debriefing with you, of thinking after the event how it went. I watched the video. I think we're doing a great job because I watched the conversation and I was entranced the entire time. I was like, oh, I forgot we talked about those couple of things, and found myself making notes. And so I appreciated it. And like you, I noticed some things visually that I just wanted to attend to as we continue to have these conversations. One way that whiteness showed up for me this week was in a working relationship that I have, where it's been really difficult to walk the line between fidelity to working agreements. This is another relationship and kind of container in which I have working agreements, and I'm doing change work around race and the mechanics of how that work gets produced. And I'm talking about contracts, I'm talking about payment, I'm talking about the administration of that work. So there's the public facing side of it, and then there's the administrative side. And the administrative side always, always, always reverts to these dominant culture norms of poor communication, urgency, no matter what, things like that. And that happened again this last week. And it was interesting. Reading this chapter was so timely because I felt like this quest for perfection, some of the things that it had gave me language for things that I experience all the time. And like I see and I sort of see the patterns, but I don't totally get it. There's one place on page 15, let me see if I can find it quickly, where it talks about excuse me, the white lady in their business has some suggestions for white women divesting ourselves from perfectionism, and she goes into a list of things. And I just feel like if some of the email communication had started with this list, or even with the working agreements that we already had, it would have helped even the administration of the work that we are trying to do have fidelity to all of our principles, and not say, well, for expediency, for this person is looking for this information, like, and I don't want to disappoint them, for these reasons I don't want to adhere to our working agreements. And I could see it, and it was still very hard for me to resist. One of the things that I
Can I
have,
ask a clarifying thing?
yeah,
So are
sure.
you talking about yourself and your actions in the urgency space, or other white people enacting that on you?
Other white people enacting that on me. And then where I struggled was, I don't know that I've talked about this in this space. I have invented a word for myself. I believe that I have what I call a credibility wound, which is that I deeply want to be taken seriously for childhood and high school reasons, all of which I firmly identify with, and none of which make me comfortable. And so anytime that there is an opportunity to perform and do well, I really want to like be the pony in that dog and pony show. Like, look, I will perform, I will do it so well. And they talked about it in this chapter. And so I worked very diligently to resist the invitations that kept coming hard and fast and confusing and very unpleasant and very uncomfortable. But that was one way that whiteness showed up for me this week, was a project that has working agreements, but that the back end of it is not necessarily holding fidelity to those.
Mm-hmm. Thank you
I
for
know.
sharing that. I know.
I needed a breath on that one.
I'm just breathing it in.
Mm-hmm.
So what I really hear you saying is that you were with a group of other white people. Am I correct in that? In that email space.
In the email space, it's 3 white women and 1 black woman, and it's essentially a contract holder, a black woman, and I on one side, and the contract provider, 2 white women on the other side. I don't want to put sides, but in this contract, there are 2 parties, and it's a black woman and a white woman and 2 white women.
And so your work this week in noticing and trying to resist those kind of tweaks to be perfectionist and performing in that space was part of the work that you were experiencing as all of this flurry of urgency and perfectionism on the receiving end of this, trying to accomplish this task. Do I have that right?
You have it absolutely right. And in the end, it ended up being the right thing, because in my continuing to ask clarifying questions and resist the urgency, what came out is that for the sake of being nice, the contract holder was actually not initially expressing a reservation. And so they were trying to push, and sort of push past the discomfort point of, I don't want to have to say X thing. When she finally said X thing, it actually didn't entail more work. It just entailed a revision of the framing of the problem. So in the end, it worked out well. And I think that's part of the thing, right? Like the systems of oppression, these structures of extraction are there to keep us distracted and exhausted. And the more we can resist that, like the fuller we can show up to the good work we're trying to do. So like I said, I was really uncomfortable, and I wanted to like send all the things right away. And I'm really glad I didn't, for a lot of reasons.
One of the ways that I avoid that is kind of like a little internal rule that I have, and it's hard to adhere to, is curious, not conclusionary. That I don't want to conclude or make up a story that I don't actually know the answer to about why this urgency, why is it happening like this, and what is this person doing? That asking those questions is part of my hard work on a regular basis about what did you really mean by that? So yeah. All right. White Lady check-in. Anything else on the White Lady check-in that I'm sure there's other things, but the one that I've been sitting with a lot this week has been thinking about how I sit in my body in ways that becomes very much an instrument of making people comfortable, which is one of my intersections. About one of the reasons that I created it like that was I was often a really forthright female in male space. I used to be a computer developer before I was a fundraiser. It was an all-white space. It was, so I was doing that to enact making men comfortable with me as a woman that they didn't quite understand. And then ended up code switching in all sorts of ways as I've begun this work about expressing and talking about racism, both my own and unpacking it in hopefully helpful ways among a community of other white women. So one of the, are you okay if I move on to somatics? Do we feel like we've done that? So one of the reasons that Jess and I are talking about this in particular is Jess and I both have a layperson's love of a practice called somatics. And I've done, I was introduced to the concept through some work in social justice. It has a history, and don't take me as an expert, I only know enough to be dangerous in this particular light. It has a history in psychology, dance, and most recently, the one that I've really been exposed to is social justice, because there is a concept that if you are not embodying anti-racism, like intentionally embodying anti-racist behavior and principles and ideals, that there's all sorts of ways that the body tells the other person what you think and feel at any given moment that you probably aren't clued into, because I mean, at least me, I was never taught nor encouraged to clue into my body as a method of communication of what I'm feeling at any given time. So, one of the things I talked about in our last session together was one of the ways that I personally identify when I am in a situation that racism is being enacted, whether by me or people that I'm around. If I'm scared and don't know what to do, often what I try to do is clue into my body, and the way that it shows up for me is a little hard electrical pulse in my chest. And that's somatics, right? In my body, this showed up like this. Another way that somatics would be is, in the chapter, the preface, that Regina Jackson talks about, people at the dinner table stopped looking at her when it got uncomfortable. That's somatics, right?
I actually loved that in the preface, Syra and Regina talk about how a dinner unfolds, and they really carefully noticed everything. They noticed posture, they noticed eye contact, they noticed position of hands, they noticed turning away or turning towards. And I love that they give credibility to this as information. And one of the things that they describe is that when they just named what they saw, the white women were like, no, that's not happening. So we can't even agree that our bodies contain information and that information is getting expressed both ways.
And somebody who's being subjected to racist behavior, of course, is clocking it because they need that information for their safety. And somebody who is used to being in the dominant culture and never having to clock somebody else's body language as a trigger of like, am I safe or am I not safe, or is this going to go sideways, or what did this person think? We are allowed that comfort of not having to be in it, to pay attention to it. So I've just found it to be, for me, like a really helpful aspect of the work that I'm doing. And I know, Jess, do you mind talking a little bit more about how this has shown up in your life and your work a little bit?
Yeah, so I've been really lucky for the last few years to work with a somatic clinician, a therapist who incorporates the practice of somatics into her therapeutic practice. And the way that I often describe it is that we bring the body into the emotional and intellectual work of healing that we do and that I do. It's been amazing. I said once to her, she thought I was trolling her, but I was dead serious. I had no information. I had no idea how much information the body held. And it does, it gives you so much information. So, an example of how this shows up in her and my therapeutic practice is, I'll be talking about something and she will register a body change that I may or may not notice in the moment. And she'll stop us and she'll say, did you notice, that thing that your body did? You did this, your arm did that. Like, did you notice that? I did or I didn't. And she'll ask me to describe to her, where is that feeling in your body? So I described to her, I could always tell her exactly where it is. It feels like an iron rod. It feels like lead sandbags. It feels like, every now and then, there was one time that I had like an oppressive fog. There's always a feeling. She asked me to describe how it looks. And then the next thing she always asks is, how old is the self that's feeling that feeling? And that gives me so much information. It gives me information about how I'm connecting with myself across time. It gives me information about a moment in the past where I may not have noticed something broke. I had an experience that I couldn't explain to myself. I had an experience that was very bad for me, but I couldn't let myself process it in the moment. And now, when I have a repeat of some of those characteristics, it may not be bad for me now, but it recalls the initial experience. And when it comes to the anti-racist work and when it comes to unpacking my own whiteness and how I respond to whiteness around me, a lot of how it comes up, I'll struggle to describe this in somatics terms for the moment, but I keep coming back to this sense of, I didn't know we were allowed to notice X, or I didn't know we were allowed to question X. A really specific example for me, I don't know if this is specific to the South. I suspect it wasn't when I was growing up in the 80s and 90s. But advertisers, when they wanted to communicate a discounted product or a not top shelf brand, they would use Black folks typically, and then other people of color. But first and foremost, Black folks, to communicate something about price and quality. And I remember having the thought when I was a kid, it's so weird that they're all okay with that. And in that moment, I could have questioned and I didn't. And that has come up for me so many times in my readings and thinkings and just, that. So
How long ago was that?
That would have been, late single digits, early double digits. So 8, 9, 10, 11, something like that.
I think the thing I'm sitting with on that has to do with perfectionism, right? Which is the subject of this chapter. That if we were held accountable for who we were 10 years ago, this is our mutual friend Yodit said this to me, and I still carry it with me all the time. That's just that's the stick that you would beat yourself with and not move forward. You know, that if I was held accountable for how I thought, felt, behaved 10 years ago, it would discount all the journey that I've made since then.
That's 100% true. And I do try not to let myself get too caught up in, chastening my younger self. But what it cues me up to now is when I see things that don't make sense, not to go, huh, but to go, huh, like just to come into it with a little bit more of an, I am actually not sure about this. Tell me more. Like you were saying a little bit ago, tell me more.
Thank you for that reflection.
Thank you. I have a feeling are going to talk a lot more about somatics and about how the body shows up in the work that we're doing. So I'm really glad you grounded us with that today.
Yes, yes. So do you want to dive in a little bit more to the book?
Yeah, let's do that.
Like we were discussing, the preface is so juicy. And thinking about the construction of these dinners is one thing that, I found really interesting, that, how to show up as an ally for two women, to have that, and I'm forgetting the name of the third partner
Lisa.
that they have, Lisa. That she does essentially like a prep of the woman who's the white woman who's going to host this for all of her white friends. And it's the dinner specifically that they've chosen in order to have this conversation for a number of reasons. But that thinking about like where to show up as an ally rather than as a controller or a, giving somebody advice that they actually don't really need. What they really need is advocacy and promotion, whatever it is. That I love how they've created this triumvirate, right? That to have Lisa do the setup for the dinner with the white lady host, with the white woman host, to talk about how do we make this space safe for Regina and Syra. And then it still went off the rails as they explained the dinner. But you did start with that, and you did have some agreements about how we were going to behave together. And it was one way that they could pull the host into helping them solve the way that the emotions had run kind of wild at the table. That was quite fascinating for me to just kind of think about how you can show up in this work in a way that's actually helpful and of allyship, and using things that are the norm to hopefully, or not the norm, part of dominant culture to smooth the way towards better understanding and more equitable practice. I don't know if that made any sense as I kind of talked about that.
I think mostly. I was sticking with you and try to stay in the moment and not like just sit here and prep my response. So, yeah, I think so. And I, like you, I appreciate that the preface started with the dinners, just as really a thorough grounding of where the work in the book came from. I want to quote something from another source, and then I want to get into a couple of my responses into chapter 1. So I appreciate your question about how do we show up as a good ally. I will say probably for the bulk of these conversations, I won't use that word. I feel like it, and I'm not inviting you into following me on this at all, but just to explain a little bit, I feel like that word has so much baggage and has become really fraught. Like, it's an easy thing to claim and a hard thing to demonstrate. And so for me, I'd rather just not hold the word, and then show up with and that's for me too. Like, I can't hang, oh, I did these 3 things on the ally coat hanger. I'm done. And so for me, I won't use ally, but how can I show up in solidarity is typically how I talk about it. When you were talking about that, it brought up something for me that I read today, and I'll post a link to the full post in the comments when this is done. But Pastor Stan Mitchell wrote today, this was in response to, it actually doesn't even matter, wrote today that if you claim to be someone's ally, but aren't getting hit by the stones thrown at them, you're not standing close enough. I run myself over with a truck every time I read it.
I know. Could you say that one more time?
Mm-hmm. Pastor Stan Mitchell said, if you claim to be someone's ally, but aren't getting hit by the stones thrown at them, you're not standing close enough.
And that, if the concept is perfectionism that we're also talking about in that chapter 1 about how perfectionist is not only killing us, but also people who are white people. It's killing white women as well. That perfectionism. I mean, what are you willing to lose? What are you willing to actually risk? And I think about this a lot, particularly as I create my own business. I'm not saying that I'm totally making bank the first couple of years, but I also do recognize that I get clients and interest because of not only the jobs that I've had access to, but also my whiteness and my presentation. And sometimes, am I willing to risk my economic viability, my ability to support myself in order to say no to a job that is certainly not meant for me? One of the things that I get a lot is people will, because I talk about racism and sharing wealth and fundraising, I'll get invited to lead a DE&I initiative or a public commentary on getting rid of an entire Black neighborhood in order to, do a civic project. I am 125% not trained for that, other than being white and making people comfortable. But it would be great to have that $20,000 that they're offering for that. So if I think about economics, and also, in the preface, they had that great conversation about economics, that they were getting, the authors were getting a lot of crap for charging anything. They're not a nonprofit, they're a company, and they're doing this as a paid facilitation part of their work. And they're kind of no matter what it is that they would charge for it, they're getting a lot of inappropriate questions about why so much, which is really what they're charging for the amount of work that they're doing is quite minimal. And then what are you doing with the money, which is B, not your business. Okay. And I think you mentioned when we were talking about it this week that was it Glennon Doyle that gets like $40,000 or something for a
it was arranged, listed on a Speakers Bureau website, and for a 45-minute to 1 hour talk, she books $50,000 to $100,000. That's her range. Whereas Syra and Regina were struggling to get $2,500 for for both of them for 2 hours, catered.
That's crazy.
Right. And then folks would ask about that. So it is, and I'm glad that we're describing it from the book. I want to be careful about resisting like the outrage porn of other people's actions. It's good. I just want to be careful.
No, they talk about that.
They do.
That your outrage, right? What was the comment? Your outrage and surprise and shock are not helpful.
White people expressing shock over racism is racism.
So I'm calling out that as a moment that me having my outrage, like that's also, that's an aspect of my internalized racism and how it's coming out.
So sort of along those lines, I appreciate you ask this question regularly, and I expect you'll do it again later in the series. What are you willing to lose? You may hear a cameo audio appearance by my dog Maya, who's very enthusiastic about something upstairs. Probably anti-racism, if I had to guess. So one of my favorite quotes from chapter one, this chapter talked about perfectionism as an essential component of not just dominant culture, white supremacy, but also how women interact with each other in the world. And I'll say American women because I don't want to speak for other cultures, but I very much appreciated how they talk about that. And when they talked about the different manifestations of perfectionism through Syra's own experience. So, as an Indian American woman, ethnic Indian, born here, but she talked about how she worked really hard for a long time to align herself with whiteness, with white expectations, white standards, white people. She said that my parents understood really early on when they came to America that the goal was assimilation. And it was implicitly clear that for success, the assimilation was to white culture, not to black culture. And she perpetuated that herself in her high school years and her college years, and perhaps a little bit beyond. And what she saw is that no matter how exceptional she was, her brown skin always mattered to the white girls and women around her. And while it was stark for Syra in that way, I do think asking us to be more critical of how we're critical of ourselves in relationship to each other is super, super, super important. We get so many, going back to Glennon Doyle, who has written stuff that I appreciate, and as another white woman has given me a lot to think about. She talks about cultural memos. My partner calls them scripts. Like, what are we given to think about or say or respond to that isn't necessarily intrinsic to how we want to do things, to our values or whatever. But if you're going to perform success in our culture, you perform these memos, you perform these scripts, and absolutely perfectionism is one of them, whether it's in hair, in skin, in clothing, in the friends you have, in the places that you go and are seen, the institutions that you claim that you're from. I think all of these things are really interesting and an invitation to, like, please, please, please adhere to our standards of perfectionism. A, so I know I'm winning the game, and B, so I don't have to be accountable. How do I want to say this? To the idea that I don't have to be enough. I don't have to be everything to be enough. That is a really scary fucking concept. And that sort of existential question is also at the heart of the white supremacy that Syra and Regina describe white women as enacting. They had a number of quotes that I wrote down from the first chapter, but the one that keeps coming back to me over and over and over again as the heart of this chapter for me is your quest to outshine each other has created for you the very opposite of community. And that's so true. Like the perfectionism thing, the good enough thing keeps us isolated. We can't totally trust folks if we're trying to be a little bit better than them, right? We can't show vulnerability if we're trying to be better. And I'm really appreciating, like, there's a lot of very frank language in this, and it's needed, and I appreciate all of this. And I actually think that was a really loving way to open the book, was to ask us to reckon with perfectionism at the heart of white culture and how white women interact with each other as a means of seeing racism and actively fighting against it.
Mm-hmm.
I know. I had to take one too. Mm-hmm.
You know, I certainly see that in myself, that there's the social media me,
Mm-hmm.
the business me, the LinkedIn me. One of the reasons that I love that we're both doing this on LinkedIn, as well as how I am now experiencing LinkedIn, is much more real,
Mm-hmm.
not a story that I'm telling for public consumption.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, And I do see that that is a loving way to say, what about community? You know, it's not just racism, it's also your community in all sorts of ways. Yes. If I wasn't jealous, competitive, scarcity mindset, what would be possible? And I think certainly you and I in our discussions, we work on those aspects, but I will not say that I am free of them. I get caught all the time like a fish hook. Yes.
I'm thinking a little bit, the authors touched on the tension a couple of times of, yes, our perfectionism is harming us as well as the folks who are caught up in these intersecting systems of oppression, and how a lot of folks aren't going to come into the work until something is at stake for themselves. And they don't really talk about this is good or this is bad. They just say it like that. And one of the things that it made me think of is this quote from Reverend Angel Kyoto Williams, who said, "No one has ever touched who has ever touched liberation could possibly want anything other than liberation for everyone." And what this makes me think of, I see this quote all the time in a friend's email signature, and I love it every time. And what it makes me think of is, I am not just here in this work to set other people free. I'm here to set myself free as well from misunderstandings that I had, from ruptured connections that I have with people in my community, folks that I would like to be in community with. It is liberation from a past, a present, and a future that's overlaid with values that I don't want to support. So that is a part of why I'm here. That and liberation from perfectionism is really at the core of a lot of the personal work that I've done as an adult. And so tying anti-racism work very deeply, very intimately in to work that I already do through therapy, through my creative practices, through my community practices, is a way of knitting it into my DNA in a way that makes it feel this is a life practice, a lifetime practice.
I love that you pulled out Reverend Williams. So I'm a Buddhist, a rather complicated Buddhist, because I recognize one of the reasons that I struggle with Buddhism in America is it's very white. You know, how many, and we have a conception of ourselves as nice white Buddhists, right? Of course, I couldn't be racist because I'm a Buddhist. And in America, that's just not, it's not possible. It's not true. But Reverend Williams, with a co-author who I'm now forgetting the name, wrote a wonderful book called Radical Dharma. That was a significant part of my journey because I was really struggling with, I am a Buddhist and I have some challenges with the communities that I am considering being a part of, because we just are not talking past our self-conception as good white people who meditate. When, you know, the Dharma can be radical. It can be about liberation and about co-liberation. Anyway, I just love that you brought that up because she's somebody that I listen to and learn from a lot. And like what you said, that I want this to be part of a deeper practice than I'm working on racism. I'm working on my own racism. I'm working on being an anti-racist. That I want it to be part of a loving practice that is part of my DNA. So yeah, thank you. I don't, are we, we're at 45 minutes. So goodness for all of you who have hung in with us or who are going to come back to have to watch this. This will be out in the recorded world. And I encourage you, as Jessica asked us to do, comment then. You don't need to comment in real time, but if you are watching this on repeat, feel free to make a comment, and Jess and I will be hanging in there and watching.
Always. Shall we say anything to wrap ourselves up? Like a closing thought or something to bring the breath into the body?
I was trying to see. I'm going to go with on page 15, the list of Lisa's suggestions for divesting yourself from perfectionism. Number 6 is recognize that mistakes happen and let them go. Learn from them and move on as part of our practice as well. So I would like to sign off imperfectly as your friend and co-unlearner in this space. And that's my centering thought. Do you have a centering thought?
I do, and it's from the same list. I loved it, and the entire chapter was powerful. The list came towards the end, so it was a nice way of sort of recapping the ideas. But the reason that I'm bringing it up is because, where's my camera? It put me in mind of this book, which is an abolitionist handbook by one of the co-founders of the Black Lives Matter hashtag, the movement for Black Lives, and all of the organizations. And one of the people that I talked to about this book, she said it's called an abolitionist a handbook, but it could be called How to Human. It's really 12 guidelines for how to be in relationship with yourself in the world in whole and healing ways. And that's really what, these kind of guidelines, divesting yourself from perfectionism, an abolitionist handbook, How to Human, like these ways of being, instead of rules for operating with each other, it's rules for operating with ourselves. And I appreciate it. I really appreciate it. It feels powerful.
Thank you, Jess. And thanks to all of you.
See you next time.